I rolled my eyes when I read the headline that Nintendo had announced a remaster of Metroid Prime, despite ranking the original among some of my all-time favourite games. Do we really need a remaster? Something that typically offers only minor graphical improvements and little else? Something that's lazier than a sloth posing as a building site foreman? And with Nintendo's track record of adding the letters H and D to their titles and calling it a day, or simply copy-pasting their Wii U catalogue over to the Switch, they certainly weren't winning me over with this. No, what we needed was an honest-to-God remake. Something that brought the graphics into the modern age, or at least as modern as the now 6-year-old Switch can handle. We needed something that would improve the incredibly dated single-stick aiming. You guys have heard of Halo Combat Evolved, right Nintendo? Some say it could even be the next big thing. I mean, would it have killed them to offer something more than a simple HD texture pack just this once? I guess I'm just disappointed after seeing how much love and attention has gone into remakes these last few years, and I hope Nintendo would have done more. Either way, I loaded the trailer up for the first time and took a look at what all the fuss was about.
A few moments later.
Ah, well, that changes things. So Nintendo are liars now. Yeah, so it seems Metroid Prime Remastered is a little more than one might first assume, being more than a simple high-res update. The graphics and controls have had a complete overhaul, but beneath still lies the workings of a game that's now 20 years old. 20 years is a long time in video game terms. The industry continues to evolve rapidly and hardware advancements mean that games can soon feel outdated. With that in mind, I don't just want to look at what was added to this remastering. Increased graphical fidelity and better controls pretty much sum that up like I previously said. Instead, I wanted to look at this game as a complete package and see whether it holds up by today's standards. And with the widespread critical and fan reception of both the remaster and the original, this should be pretty clear cut, right? Is it still the crowning jewel of the FPS genre? Or is it just an energy-sucking parasite gorging itself on my nostalgia? Let's find out as I take a look at Metroid Prime Remastered. So the original first released back in November 2002 and was developed and published by Retro Studios and Nintendo respectively. Retro Studios have returned for the remaster, albeit with a few extra developers chipping in here and there. For clarity, I'll be comparing the remaster to the PAL version of the original, since that's the version I'm most accustomed to. And as a heads up, this is your spoiler warning for the rest of the video. I'll be covering most major areas of the game, from plot to weapon upgrades, so if you don't want the thrill of the hunt spoiling for you, then go and enjoy the game first before heading any further. The game starts with Samus Aran, an intergalactic bounty hunter who's answering a distress signal from a frigate in orbit around Talon 4. After doing some rather impressive gymnastics off the top of her ship, she soon finds the frigate belongs to a band of space pirates, an alien race, or races depending on who you ask, who are hell-bent on galactic domination. The ship has been overrun by parasitic aliens, and it's up to Samus to fix the problem. She confronts the parasite queen, chucks it into the reactor causing it to overload, and from there on out it's just you, a boatload of explosions, and a ticking clock as you scurry to find the exit. During the escape, Samus encounters Ridley, the series' recurring antagonist, who escapes to Talon 4. After getting caught in an explosion, Samus' suit is damaged and most of her abilities are lost. Undeterred, Samus hops in a gunship and makes haste to the planet below to begin the hunt for Ridley. So, what do you think of the story so far? Are you enjoying it? Good, because that's all you're getting. After this point, the story is basically non-existent for the rest of the game. There's a plot about a meteor that impacted on the planet and is polluting the world with a radioactive substance known as phazon. There's even a plot about the previous inhabitants trying to contain the phazon, along with a creature living inside the meteor, but they're all inevitably wiped out. The problem with this is the game never really highlights these threads the same way it did with its opening scenes. The opening gave a clear direction of why Samus is on the frigate, and without needing a word of dialogue, is able to show there's some connection between her and Ridley, which prompts her to give chase. It's hardly Shakespeare, but it certainly does the job. From there on out, the rest of the story, and the events that led up to your arrival, are presented through data logs scattered around the world. The idea works well on paper, as it lets the players who want to investigate more thoroughly do just that, and be rewarded with more insight. The problem is that Metroid Prime wants to have its cake and eat it too. These plot threads are quite important to understanding what's happening, yet the information to do so is very easy to miss. There's a couple of cutscenes sprinkled throughout that seem to want to remind you of your goal, but they never amount to anything, so you'll likely just continue to travel the world looking to rearm yourself. With that said, the game ends with Samus about to break into the meteor to put an end to the phase-on problem, when Ridley conveniently shows up and attacks her. Ridley is defeated, Samus enters the meteor and finds a Metroid as a source of the phase-on, and so proceeds to blow the place up like she does everywhere else she goes. Credits roll, there's a sequel bait 100% bonus clip, the end. There really isn't all that much to say about the story itself. It's serviceable enough, gives adequate justification for the game to take place, and it sprinkles in a dose of nostalgia for returning fans. But let's be honest here, 30 seconds after you landed on Talon 4, you forgot all about the plot. And that's fine, more than fine even, because the story was never the reason why Metroid Prime is so fondly remembered. I've always found Metroid Prime to be unnerving growing up. Something about it was so different from anything else I've played. It wasn't a horror game, and it wasn't gory enough to warrant an 18 rating. Yet it was prompting a similar fight or flight response that those types of games deliver. Sure, part of that'll come from being younger and being less exposed to mature content, but that reason alone doesn't quite cut it. I think one of the main reasons Metroid Prime is remembered so fondly is because it so expertly immerses the player in its world, masterfully delivering tension through its atmosphere and environmental storytelling. The opening on the frigate is a brilliant example of that, and is personally one of my all-time favourite introductory levels. Entering the ship for the first time and witnessing the aftermath of an alien outbreak instantly sets a scene, as injured or dead pirates litter the walkways and gantries as parasites feed on their remains. What little life that's left on the ship is hostile to you, giving you a hint towards the overall tone of the game, all the while an appropriately ominous sci-fi soundtrack cautiously spurs you on. The hallways are claustrophobic, while the attention to detail in the research rooms paint a picture of who the space pirates are and what their goal is. After you've dealt with the Parasite Queen, you're forced to make haste as the explosions and soundtrack hurry you out of the door. You've had just enough time to learn the controls, but yet it feels almost like it's throwing you in at the deep end still. The presentation of the game up until that point was to tread carefully, but now it's pushing you to pick up the pace. As introductions go, it has it all. Tension, high stakes action, and all the while teaching the player the controls, but most importantly, it's instantly able to tell you what to expect from the game. However, Prime then mixes things up a bit. When you arrive on Talon 4, you land in a clearing in the middle of nowhere. There's no fanfare, it's raining and oddly peaceful. The events that took place only moments ago could have been from an entirely different game, yet it's not jarring in the slightest. In fact, sometime during this moment of calm, as you're feeling your way around the landscape, a cold chill may run down your spine as you realise just how alone you are in this foreign land. It's that loneliness and isolation that's the backbone of Metroid Prime. You're alone on the frigate, just as you are now, just as you will be when you explore deeper. And the deeper you go, the stronger the feeling gets. Despite that, the game manages to keep things fresh with a diverse range of biomes, from swamps and ruins to lava-filled caverns and snow-covered mountains. They manage to feel distinct from one another in both layout and aesthetics, but they're all brought together through the overarching themes. All the while the soundtrack adds a whole other dimension to the atmosphere of each place. As much as I love the soundtrack, you'll be doing yourself a huge favour turning the background music off for at least one of your playthroughs. There's something haunting about visiting long abandoned places with nothing more than the clank of your space boots ricocheting down metal corridors to keep you company. It's very isolating indeed. But being isolated doesn't equal weakness, and Prime is able to sell the character of Samus as an experienced and stoic bounty hunter through attention to detail, but more importantly, to convey to the player just how it might feel to don the spacesuit yourself. From the movement of the hood and the condensation build-up on the visor, to the flash of Samus's reflection after a burst of light. These details may seem small on their own, but I'd argue this is one of the closest iterations a video game has come to capturing the essence of wearing a technologically advanced spacesuit. Thing is, a lot of this stuff is lost in other FPS games, which is a shame as it's yet another way of immersing the player in the game world. These details looked impressive 20 years ago, and it's nice to see the remaster has continued to innovate them. Water droplets that trickle off your arm cannon are now affected by the direction you aim it, while the heat visor displays the different temperatures of your beam weapons in a much more defined manner, just to name a couple of improvements. But what really makes the atmosphere of this game pop? The proverbial cherry gracing the top of Mr. Kipling's finest Bakewell tart? The thing that brings it all together is the scan visor. Samus has access to 4 visors by the end of the game, and they're largely used to find secrets and target things not visible to the naked eye. However, the scan visor is different in that it's used to highlight key points of interest should you need some assistance. Growing up, I thought this was the height of dull. Who the hell wants a visor that forces me to read? I'd spent all day doing that at school, and now the game had the gall to give me literacy homework. The thermal visor wouldn't do that to me. Oh no, it'd happily let me blind myself at will should I ever switch it on in the magma caverns. You don't make that mistake twice, that's for sure. In hindsight, I couldn't have been more wrong, and the versatility of the scan visor makes it my favourite by a country mile now. Switching this thing on in just about any location will give you a plethora of information on your surroundings. Scanning enemies gives tips on how to take them down, while seemingly innocuous objects are brought to life with tidbits of trivia. This simple tool adds so much depth to the game, more so than any of the main plot beats do in my opinion. As I'm playing, I'm learning about the Metroid universe, and it gives me that feeling that I've made some major scientific breakthrough. Best of all, outside of 100% in the game, it's largely optional and is never intrusive in breaking the flow of the game. Though if you are looking at collecting all the scannable objects in the game, take my advice and keep a guide of all the missable entries to hand. Prime certainly isn't afraid to kill a perfect save game stone dead. Boss encounters, I get, but despawning the only Aqua Sentry drone or flock of ice shriek bats shortly after first meeting them, even though they look identical to their regular variants, will always be a shitty move. But moving swiftly along, we couldn't very well talk about the remaster without bringing up the insane graphical overhaul that Prime has received. Everything from texture work and lighting to the character models have seen a complete revamp, and it all looks fantastic to say the least. Despite running on the Switch, the vibrancy of the colour palette manages to elevate each biome, promoting their distinctive characteristics, all the while managing to run at 60 FPS and completely eradicate the load times when moving between different rooms. And the best part is about all this, is Retro didn't lose the look of the original in the update. It's often the case with remakes, whether it's down to a different game engine or a different creative direction. Somewhere in the sea of impressive graphical enhancements do things get lost in translation. Of course, this isn't even a remake, but let's be perfectly honest, from the step up in visual fidelity and the reworking of the controls, to the uninitiated, Metroid Prime finds itself nestled snugly alongside the Resident Evil 4 and Dead Space remakes, and I wouldn't blame them for thinking that, because it's not simply ignorance that guides their opinion, more so it's a testament to how great a job has been done here. Prime has more than its looks however, and its gameplay manages to create an addicting formula right from the get-go. At its very core, Prime's gameplay loop is this: you're placed in a room with no clear direction or guidance systems with only a choice of multiple doorways to venture through. Exploring one will most likely result in a dead end requiring you to backtrack and try another. Eventually, you'll pick the right one where you'll be rewarded with a new power-up such as a double jump or weapon. From here, you'll be able to go back to one of the routes that was blocked off and use your new ability to forge a path ahead, where the cycle repeats itself. The further you progress, the more options present themselves, and eventually new shortcuts will bridge otherwise distant points together, helping to make the disorienting task of navigation that much more manageable. It's been done a million times before, but there's a reason this genre is known as a Metroidvania, and it's important to remember that this franchise played a huge part in moulding this gameplay style. I mention this now because as a franchise that had all but mastered its own genre in the 2D capacity, Metroid Prime was truly a first of its kind when they took it into the 3D realm, particularly with opting to go into the first-person perspective. With that in mind, it's bound to have some glaring issues. You might be able to tighten up the controls and smarten up the graphics, but at its core it's still a 2-decade-old experimental game made with inferior hardware. There's no hiding that fact. So then, it may come as a surprise that the level design does more than just hold its own by today's standards. It still feels engaging to explore, with every dead end giving you more insight on how the layout fits together. To the uninitiated, the lay of the land is purely nonsensical, with elevators to various parts of the planet seemingly scattered around at will. But dig a little deeper, and just about everything in this game connects together beautifully, with one power-up leading directly to the next. It has to be said that I'm lucky in this regard. I have the gift of hindsight. I know where everything is because I've previously played it, and I like that about it. I think that's one of the reasons why I keep coming back to it. When I first started playing, I was exploring an alien landscape where the trek through the Chozo ruins to the mines felt like a grand old adventure because I was learning my way around. Whereas now, that same journey takes mere minutes. In many ways, it reminds me of the mansion from Resident Evil 1. All those rooms to explore can be daunting, but the reality is that the item you're looking for is just down the hallway. The map makes near total sense in its design, but without any waypoints or a general sense of direction, you are all but guaranteed to get lost on your first playthrough. I've always felt that was part of the charm, given that learning the map meant that mopping up collectibles and subsequent playthroughs become more streamlined, but I can appreciate that Prime's map can be an acquired taste at times. The game does have an optional alert system should you spend too much time dawdling aimlessly, which is nice enough, but receiving a notification towards your next objective, only to find you spent the last 10 minutes going in the wrong direction, can feel like a bit of a slap in the face at times. This system was present in the original PAL release, so it's a shame there wasn't an extra setting to alert the players as soon as they acquire their latest upgrade, giving the game a more linear approach while helping beginners find their feet. Of course, no game is perfect, and despite being part of Prime's main appeal, backtracking can be a bit of a pain at times. The boost ball to wave beam portion of the game has you going from one end of the world only to return back to where you started, while the spider ball to gravity suit sequence is similar in its execution as well. Both of these examples require revisits to Phendrana drifts, which is where the problem lies. The drifts are tied for having the least number of elevators out of any biome, as well as being only accessible through the magma caverns. That alone wouldn't be too much of an issue, but the caverns act as the backbone of this game's traversal system, meaning that you'll be travelling through them on numerous occasions. The game feels like it bottlenecks at this place, being one long cave designed akin to a tram link for every other area in the game. I think this would have worked better if it was more of a centralised room with elevators branching off from it, something like Crash 2's Warp Room just on a much bigger scale. Along with that, just slap an elevator in Phendrana Drifts that takes you to the Talon overworld and you are golden. Not that I expected any of this to be fixed in a remaster, but I had to mention it either way. Putting all that aside though, and there's still a lot to love about the layout of Metroid Prime, and even after all this time, it is a hell of a lot of fun finding out where that next corridor is going to take you. To keep the backtracking engaging, the game has to make sure it's actually worth trudging through the arse end of some corruption-infested planet for the sake of the latest killer app. Thankfully, Prime has a solid foundation to build off of, with a lot of the series' staple items returning from Super Metroid. There's a nice variety here, from different beam weapons and visors to suit upgrades, with everything working well together to make you feel more and more superhuman with each power-up. I'll go into my thoughts on the weapons a bit later on, but my favourite utilities typically involve enhanced traversal. There's just something satisfying about returning to previously difficult to navigate areas, only to use the space boots or grapple to completely bypass the challenge altogether. It feels like you're growing in your abilities with each use, and is yet another way the level layout lends itself to the gameplay so well. For me, the biggest improvement on this front has got to be the inclusion of the spring ball, letting you jump while in morph ball mode with a simple button press instead of relying on a bomb explosion for hang time. This was a feature of the Prime Trilogy re-release back on the Wii, but as someone who never played that version, this was a big step up for me. Sure, some puzzles become rather trivialised by its inclusion, but it's never forced into gameplay, meaning you could simply choose not to use it if you so wish. This simple update speeds up the gameplay by letting you spend more time moving around in the morph ball without getting stuck on the slightest of inclines every other step. Combine that with the vast amount of health you can amass early on if you know where to look, and you can simply run through rooms without ever paying a second thought to the enemies who spent the last 3 days camped out there waiting for you. Of course, the upgrades that I've talked about so far are all required for progression, but Prime also has a number of optional upgrades hidden around the environment as well. These, for the most part, come in the form of missile expansions which are used to increase your carry capacity for the missile launcher. Despite revolving largely around one type of upgrade, the system works very well as missiles have a range of versatility both in and out of combat encounters. The more you can find, the quicker you'll be able to tear through enemies or unearth more secrets without constantly needing to scavenge for ammo. This does wonders at helping to flesh out the levels, keeping you alert to your surroundings, and makes the sometimes arduous task of backtracking in potentially the wrong direction much more bearable when you find a few of these along your travels. It helps to soften the blow, all the while gearing you up until you're more kitted out than a magneton breezing along a Swiss Army knife production line. Naturally, hidden upgrades live up to their namesake, so you'll have to use the faint humming sound that they emit to track them down. It's a classic mechanic among collectathons, and it works just as well here. You'll normally need a specific item to access upgrades, but typically they'll involve breaking down the wall of some unassuming piece of terrain that can only be destroyed with a specific weapon. This of course means you won't be able to sweep everything up as you go, which normally bugs the hell out of me. Spyro 2 is a good example of this, with its handful of gems in 1 or 2 levels that require a move from the following homeworld. Anyway, I'm going off topic here. Thankfully, Prime has better reasoning for structuring the game this way, as the amount of times you'll revisit old ground and the general structuring of the final act means you'll naturally return to these areas on numerous occasions, letting you choose whether to break off from your current objective for a mid-game advantage, or get the bulk of them towards the end. One of my favourite parts of hunting upgrades is figuring out what weapon to use to break through to it. The scan visor won't outright tell you what'll do the job, but it'll give you a hint of what the material is made from. From there, it's a simple case of experimenting to see what works, and before long you'll be able to distinguish your cordite from your sandstone and know exactly what to do to claim your reward. It's such a simple premise, but it really makes collecting upgrades feel oh so satisfying, and even immerses the player more in the world by requiring them to think for themselves, reading the information presented to them and connecting the dots together. That being said, if you are going for 100% completion, then tracking down all of these upgrades can become a bit of a chore. There's nothing in the game that gives you hints to their locations like in Metroid Prime 3, and I think that's a bit of a letdown on the remaster's part. A handful of the upgrades are in some pretty devious places, and chances are if you're missing one, it'll be this one right here. Sure, it's the age of the internet, so you can easily just look it up in a guide, but I still prefer it when the game gives you the tools to track everything down yourself, without expecting you to waste your life searching under every rock. At the very least, it would have helped if the remaster added a totals list to the map screen for each biome, so you can at least narrow down your search radius somewhat. And that brings me nicely onto the worst part of Metroid Prime, the Chozo artifacts. There are 12 of these hidden around the world and are used as keys to unlock the final boss. We're not talking of some super secret optional boss, mind you, just the bog standard one needed to see the credits roll. That means that the game essentially grinds to a halt until you go back through the entire world and pick up all of these. The game does give you hints to their locations, which means you won't be completely lost, but nonetheless it feels like a needlessly convoluted step just to finish the game. It didn't work when Rayman 1 tried it, and it doesn't work here either, so it's a shame that this wasn't tightened up more in the remaster, by letting you gather a percentage of them instead of forcing you to collect the lot. It's surprising to me that they didn't take this approach, considering Wind Waker suffered from a similar issue with its Triforce charts, which was fixed using that same method in its HD remaster. In many ways, the combat of Metroid Prime is its weakest component. It's not bad per se, but it's not as in-depth as other FPS titles, even ones around the launch of the original. Typically, encounters offer little more than locking onto an enemy, blasting it until it stops moving, or until your finger goes numb, rinse and repeat. The 4 beam weapons you'll acquire throughout your adventure feel like they do largely the same thing, just with increased damage to match the power creep. The most interesting of these is the Ice Beam, being able to freeze enemies solid then shatter them with a single missile. It's the closest thing this game's combat has to synergy. However, once you have the Plasma Beam and its fiery lasers of death are disintegrating everything in sight, all the other beams just turn into glorified door keys. The Plasma Beam is unlocked pretty late on, so until that point missiles will be your best friend and round out your main arsenal as a higher damage dealing alternative capable of homing in on targets. The trade-off being that you can only carry a maximum of 5 when you first get the launcher, and have to explore and complete basic puzzles to find capacity upgrades as mentioned previously. The missile launcher is easily my favourite weapon in the game. The projectiles look ace with their blue-silver trail, they've got decent splash damage, they're great for flying enemies, and most importantly, you can rapid fire them. This is technically a glitch, but damn does it feel satisfying chaining these things together, like a cowboy keeping rhythm with each hammer pull of their revolver. Like a gunslinger even. Yes, a space gunslinger. Anyway, thank the Lord this wasn't patched out by the fun police over at Nintendo. Upgrades allowing you to combine beams and missiles into one devastating attack can also be found, and are mostly optional, which adds a bit of decision making on when best to get them. Or at least it would if these things were actually any good. The Wave Buster chews through missile ammo and doesn't kill all that quick, having only one use for fighting the Shadow Drone boss guarding the Power Bomb upgrade. The Ice Spreader freezes multiple foes when close to each other, which almost never happens and is acquired around the same time as the Plasma Beam, whereas the Flamethrower also burns through ammo while having a shorter range than any of your other weapons. You'd honestly have better luck holding a cigarette lighter up to a space pirate's chin whiskers than using this. The Super Missile, on the other hand, is godlike. It does exactly what it says on the tin, everything a normal missile would do, but better, beefier and bigger. And at only 5 missile ammo per shot, it's ideal for kicking Chozo Ghost back through the doors of oblivion. I do think it's a shame that the Morph Ball gets very little use in combat situations, outside of boosting away from a couple of boss's attacks. But with how vulnerable you are switching in and out of it, the decision to leave well alone was probably for the best. Power Bombs are a great insta-kill option though if those damn Physian Metroids won't leave you alone. Speaking of bosses, I absolutely hate them. This is the single aspect of the game that makes me question whether another playthrough of one of my favourite games is even worth it. God, these things are boring. It's the same lock-on and spam gameplay from standard encounters, only now you have to wait for an opening to attack. Wait being the key word here. And some of these fights can easily take over 10 minutes. 10 minutes of repetitive patterns, dodging the same 1 or 2 attacks, just standing there with the trigger held down, filling out a risk assessment form while you wait. Thardus, Ridley, and worst of all, Metroid Prime on hard mode remind me that death isn't the thing to be scared of, it's the eternal limbo that follows. Overall, I've always had a love-hate relationship with this game's combat. Sure, it's basic and certain elements of it don't gel with me, but I'm still glad it's here. It breaks the cold, somber tone of the rest of the game with bursts of action, and dispatching a group of pirates with a barrage of missiles is always a fun time. Having said all of that, nothing about the combat is broken, and even after all this time, the way it handles manages to feel unique from everything else on the market, so there's still some merit to it in that regard. And if that's not quite enough for you, just stock up on energy tanks and sprint past everything in sight. The controls of the original version of Metroid Prime are always a bit on the quirky side to say the least. They never outright put me off returning to the game the same way the forced motion controls of Prime 3 do, but anytime I booted up the game I knew I'd be fighting against them more than any of the intended challenges in the game. For the fortunate few who are unaware of the original control scheme, both sticks used for aiming and strafing in traditional FPS games were merged into one, meaning turning and movement more closely resembled tank controls than anything else. If you wanted to look up or down, you'd have to stand in place, all the while the camera will snap back to the centre of the screen with every opportunity it gets. And to top it all off, there was no option for increasing the sensitivity, which meant that a full 180-degree turn would take longer to complete than a Metal Gear Solid cutscene compilation video. The thing to take away from this history lesson is that these controls are a complete mess, even by 2002 standards. I mention all of this now because the glow up that this remaster gave to the control scheme is single-handedly its greatest feature in my opinion. All of the issues above have been completely fixed, and what we have now is a game that plays just as well as any other modern shooter. Sure, that doesn't mean that Prime will suddenly become a haven for detailed FPS mechanics. The controls haven't changed the DNA of the game after all, but thanks to this improvement, everything from the platforming and traversal to the combat and aesthetics feel like they flow better from this simple change. There are even a few extra settings added to the game this time around. Aiming, sensitivity and colorblind settings make up the majority of them, and they're a pretty standard affair, but it's still a welcome improvement from what came before. Though the most interesting settings have got to be the alternative control options. Along with dual stick being the control scheme by default, you can also play the game with motion controls mimicking the trilogy release, hybrid controls for a mixture of motion and the original, which absolutely no one was asking for, as well as the classic GameCube setup for the utterly deranged masochists out there. The point I'm making here is whether you're a fan of the trilogy controls, a purist who wants to experience the exact feel of the original game, or someone who felt the controls needed modernising, then the remaster has got you covered, and it's little things like that that help to make this the definitive version. In truth, there isn't all that much else to say about the controls. They do what's expected of them, and they do it very well. If I absolutely had to find fault, I'd say that swapping beams and firing super missiles can be a bit cumbersome if you're not playing Claw. The devs must have thought that too, since there's a couple of button remapping options, but they're not all that helpful in all honesty, often just shifting the problem to another area of the controller. Would have been nice if they let you completely remap them to your heart's content. Mapping the beam swap to L and right stick while putting the super missiles to X would solve a lot of my problems with the setup, and I think I could live without bumper jumper controls in my non-competitive single player game. Having said that, these are nitpicks more than anything else. Sure, it would be nice if it was added, but its exclusion most definitely won't hurt your overall experience with the game. The fact that they changed the position of the scan visor from left to right stung more than any of the above. 20 damn years of muscle memory is going to fight against this at every opportunity it gets. So, with all that said and done, Metroid Prime Remastered, is it actually any good? Without a shadow of a doubt, yeah, it is. The original elements of the game still hold up incredibly well, with its layout being largely well structured by very subtly keeping you on track to your next objective. Its structuring meant that being thorough but attentive would reward players with quicker lines to their next upgrade, while the burden of taking a wrong turn was softened thanks to the clever positioning of an energy tank or missile expansion. The slew of upgrades let you interact with a level layout differently each time you backtrack through them, while the use of the first-person perspective and the environmental storytelling built up the atmosphere and captured the very essence of isolation. Yes, the combat could be a little basic at times, but even that has a uniqueness to it that's sure to resonate with people who are tired of more traditional FPS gameplay. The original was able to take a franchise that seemed to peak in the 2D era and completely reinvent the wheel by bringing that same core premise into the third dimension. It's something that we take for granted now, but even the best in their field have struggled with that feat. Whereas the remastered version takes everything that was great about the original and pulls it into the modern age with a brilliant set of visuals and a much needed adjustment to the control scheme. It manages to go above and beyond what a traditional remaster is considered to do, and that needs to be commended for sure. There are still one or two areas that I felt could have been realistically improved, mainly based around the Chozo artifacts, but none of that deters me from enjoying this classic. In 2002, this game was brilliant, and 20 years on, it certainly hasn't lost its appeal. Though some backtracking may be a little off-putting to a modern audience, I still believe this game will cement itself in the hearts of an entirely new generation of players, all the while reminding us veterans what was so special about it the first time round. From the surprise announcement and the same day release, to seeing just how far they'd pushed the term remaster, it's moments like this that remind me why I have a passion for video games. If you enjoyed this video, please consider supporting the channel by liking and subscribing, and let me know what your favourite part of the remaster was down in the comments section. As always, thank you for watching if indeed you still are. Ta-ra!